America, a land of freedom and opportunity, a nation that has been growing for the past 240 years through hardships and blessings alike. However, while millions of people have worked to make this country the behemoth of democracy and prosperity it is today, one man in particular is credited as the father of his country. That man is George Washington. The first president of the United States, born on February 11, 1731, Washington was as simple a man as they come. He was a farmer at heart, a tradition passed on from his father, Augustine Washington. Augustine owned several plantations that the Washingtons moved in and out of frequently, though George spent most of his childhood on a ferry farm in Fredericksburg, Virginia. It was the same farm that George inherited when Augustine passed away in 1743, when the little Washington was only 11 years old. Due to his father's early death, George was unable to study formally in England like his older half-brothers had. His prime educators soon became Lawrence Washington, one such half-brother, and the Fairfax family, to which one member Lawrence was married, Anne Fairfax. However, George pursued a certain degree of education on his own. The Rules of Civility, a guidebook to proper etiquette and social interaction, was the young Washington's Bible. He copied its preachings to the letter, developing himself into a fine young gentleman. Such interests would allow him to grow and develop into the charismatic, commanding leader he was destined to become, despite a lack of education.
In 1748, Washington partook in his first surveying expedition, and then two more following it. His experiences on the frontier began to kindle an interest in becoming a part of the military, and his first position was assigned to him by Virginia's Lieutenant Colonel Dinwiddie. This would pave the way for his greatest military undertaking, the Revolutionary War. But even before then, he retained a myriad of military knowledge during the French and Indian War. In 1753, Washington was sent to a French fort in the Ohio River Valley by Dinwiddie to reclaim what land England believed was rightfully theirs. After the French insisted that they were the undisputed owners of the land, a small skirmish erupted in 1754 between the two parties, and Washington was at the head of it, despite ending up the loser. Essentially, Washington had started a world war, and even resigned his commission due to the embarrassing loss. But the up-and-coming national leader found ways to make the most of the situation. As General Edward Braddock's aide, Washington spent his time carefully studying military manuals and Braddock's style of giving commands and orders. At one point, Braddock was mortally wounded in the Battle of Monongahela. Washington took command of the leaderless troops and got them safely out of the panic. This act of bravery won him his first military position as the commander of all of Virginia's military forces. However, after being denied his request to be a British general, Washington returned to Mount Vernon, which he inherited from Lawrence Washington upon his stepbrother's demise, and soon married Martha Dandridge Custis, who brought two children from a previous marriage, Jack and Patsy. Washington never had any children of his own. Washington was never destined to be just a family man. Despite presenting resolutions written by George Mason on taxation without representation to the Virginia House of Burgesses, Washington was never heavily embroiled in the anti-British sentiment developing in the colonies prior to the Revolutionary War. Yet upon being elected a delegate to the First Continental Congress, Washington found himself being thrust right into the escalating conflict. Unfortunately for Washington, the Continental Army included 8,000 soldiers and 12,000 militia, who could walk right off at any moment, a fairly miserable undertaking when compared to Britain's roughly 80,000 active servicemen. One of the earliest battles of the Revolutionary War was the Battle of Long Island, when the British Army had the American Army cornered. Washington narrowly escaped and ended up retreating across New Jersey. Washington was able to reciprocate this embarrassing loss with wins in the battles of Dorchester Heights, Princeton, and Trenton, the latter of which scored Washington the capture of 1,000 Hessian troops. However, when all was said and done, after Washington's forces surrounded the British General Cornwallis's forces at Yorktown, the final battle of the Revolutionary War, Washington had lost more battles than he had won. Despite this fact, Washington's resolve in his nation to succeed and his fight for freedom never faltered. In 1783, after the Peace Treaty of Paris between the United States and England was brokered, Washington issued a tear-jerking farewell address, expecting to fade out of the public eye and retire to his beloved Mount Vernon.
Gentlemen, it is with a heavy heart that I offer back my commission. My work is done, and now I look forward to retiring from the great theater of action. I came in here a general, I shall leave a private citizen.
Yet it seemed the budding nation could not survive without Washington. After the Articles of Confederation failed, the United States needed a new doctrine to operate under. In the summer of 1787, the Constitutional Convention was held in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Washington headed it as the chairman of the convention. He brought a sense of credibility to the convention, and Washington's watchful eye ensured that this new constitution would not lead to a corrupt monarchy. This new constitution called for an overarching executive officer, a president to be precise, and Washington was just the man for the job. He was later unanimously elected in the election of 1789. Washington started off his presidency with an appreciation for precedents, placing his hand on the Bible during his inauguration, adding, "So help me God," to the end of the oath, and establishing his plans for the term in the form of an inaugural address. Washington also established his cabinet, who aided him in some of his most influential actions during his first term. Some of these actions included adding a Bill of Rights to the Constitution, which guaranteed rights of the people, organizing the federal court system through the Judiciary Act of 1789, and creating economic stability by initiating Alexander Hamilton's three-part plan that established the National Bank. However, other actions were not as revered. When an excise tax was placed on whiskey, Western whiskey distillers refused to pay up, and soon appeared to be initiating a violent rebellion. Washington immediately marched out to the west with 13,000 militiamen and crushed the rebellion, solidifying the new nation's zero tolerance of the use of violence to show dissatisfaction with the United States. Washington stated that the whiskey distillers had the representation in Congress that they had lacked in British Parliament, so therefore they would voice their concerns and only voice their concerns. Another rising problem Washington perceived was the rise of political parties, primarily the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Fearing that the development of such parties would lead to a rift in the young nation, Washington ran for a second term in hopes of discouraging such actions, and once again won unanimously.
Though throughout his second term, Washington was plagued by more issues than just political parties. The French Revolution and France's declaration of war on Great Britain caused a conundrum. The United States was still part of a partnership with France, but aiding them in a war against Britain would place the U.S. in opposition to one of its most lucrative trading partners. To solve this, Washington issued a proclamation of neutrality, stating it would take a step back from such foreign affairs. This did not prevent Great Britain from continually impressing U.S. sailors, occupying forts on U.S. soil, and inciting Native Americans to fight the Americans. Washington tried to remedy these incursions with Jay's Treaty, though impressment remained an issue for many years afterwards. On the flip side, under Washington's administration, the United States gained the ability to navigate the Mississippi River and disputed lands north of Florida from Spain in Pinckney's Treaty. By 1797, it was finally time for Washington to retire. Declining a third term, and in the process settling yet another precedent, Washington stressed his final views on important issues in his farewell address. He continued to deplore political parties and permanent foreign alliances, and begged Americans to remain united so would the budding United States. And with that, George Washington returned to Mount Vernon after the years of service to his nation. 2 years later, in 1799,
early one winter morning, he rode out to inspect his estate. When he returned, he complained of a sore throat. A fever developed, and 2 days later, on the 14th of December, 1799, he died. He was 67 years old.
As he left this earth, he also left one of the greatest legacies of any man ever. He had to start from scratch in a completely uncharted governmental structure with no one before him to model his actions off. Yet, despite his challenge and dozens of others he had to face as the leader of a new nation in a hostile world, he never backed down from the challenge and abandoned his country. George Washington fathered that country through his presidency and beyond, leaving his mark as one of the most influential leaders of all time.